I'll be preaching from Mark chapter 8. It's our gospel lesson, Mark chapter 8, verses 31 to 38. Peter is having a bad day in our gospel lesson. And it's kind of hard for Peter because actually if you look at the story immediately before this, Peter was having a good day, right? Jesus asked, "Who do you say that I am?" immediately before this, and the disciples went, "Some people say Elijah, some people say a prophet." And Jesus said, "Well, who do you say that I am?" And Peter gave the right answer. He said, "You are the Messiah, the Son of God." And then immediately Jesus goes into talking about what that actually means, and what it actually means is this whole suffering and death and resurrection business. Jesus is saying this quite openly, and Peter is kind of looking at him and going, "Suffering? Who said anything about suffering, Jesus? Come on." And so he tries to correct Jesus. Lord, grant me that kind of confidence in my own life. And from there on out, Peter's kind of having a bad day. Jesus looks at him, calls him Satan, which I'm sure was a bit traumatic for Peter. And then Jesus says, "For you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." After that, Jesus says this line, which if somebody asked me, "How do you live as a Christian? What does it mean to live as a Christian?" I would probably just quote them this line. Jesus says that we must take up our cross because those who want to save their life will lose it. And those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. Jesus makes this argument and what he says is that there's two different ways of going about living your life as a follower of Jesus Christ. There's the way of trying to save your own life, but Jesus says that will always end up failing. You will always lose it in the end. Or there's the way of losing your life, of giving it up. And in giving it up, you will find new life again. It seems kind of nonsensical, right? It seems like nonsense. Doesn't even truly make sense, except for the fact that I've kind of seen it lived out in the life of the church before. So I offer you 3 examples of churches who have lost their life, and by losing it, have saved it. First one comes from our sister church, that's First English. For those of you who go down to First English now, it's a thriving ministry. It feeds hundreds of people. It's a lovely thing. But about 15 to 20 years ago, they were only a couple months from closing the doors. They had about 6 months left of funds. They were going to do a wedding for a son of the congregation, and that was going to be it. The doors would be closed forever. To complete this door closing process, they called Pastor Bob, who is kind of a force of nature, if you've never met him. Some of you are laughing because you've met him and you know what I mean. They called Pastor Bob. I'm not sure they knew what they were getting when they called him, but Pastor Bob asked them to do just one thing. He said, "Let's just stop trying to make the money last as long as possible. I know we've got this much in savings. Let's just stop trying to milk it for as long as possible, and let's just do ministry for 6 months, and let's see where that takes us." So they started a Sunday morning breakfast for the community. That's no mean feat. Many of you still go down to that breakfast. That's where it was birthed. And while they only had 6 months left of money, you know what? 15, 20 years later, they're still open. As Jesus says, those who want to save their life will lose it. And those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. My previous church had a moment like this. This is story number 2. There was one year where I had to find a particular motion in council from the history of the church, and so I read through 30 years of council minutes. "30 years of every fight, conflict that had ever happened. Lord help me." But there was this one interesting moment where, near the beginning that I read of my trip through, so about 30 years ago, where the neighborhood around the church was changing. It was changing into a more inner city neighborhood. People were leaving. Congregants were leaving because they didn't want to be in a neighborhood like that. It was a hard time for them. And there was a discussion in church council about whether they should sell the building and move out to the suburbs or whether they should stay in that neighborhood and stay committed to it. They voted to stay in council. Now, this was no easy decision. About half the people got up and left after they made that vote. And yet, that church is still there doing awesome ministry. As Jesus says, those who want to save their life will lose it. And those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention this one. This one comes from you all, right? In that a church down the street had a church fire. And we could have said we don't have room. We don't have space. It's too much to ask. And yet, what did you all do? Supremely willingly, by the way, which is what I'm most impressed about. We got up and moved to the old worship space. And 6 months later, here we are. And I think we have been blessed by being here and by welcoming those who needed welcome. As Jesus says, those who seek to save their life will lose it. And those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. In each of those stories, there's an alternative way of living that could have been very realistically done. First English could have said, no, we're just going to milk what's left of the savings as long as possible. My previous church could have said, yeah, let's sell the building and move out to the suburbs. You all could have said, we don't have enough space. There's not enough to go around. In each one of those situations, we could have said, we've got to save our lives. We've got to try and save and hoard and store up for ourselves. And I would bet that in each of those situations, that would have been the path toward losing their life. I don't think First English would still be here if they had decided just to try and milk the savings as long as possible. I don't think my previous church would have survived out in the suburbs. I don't think we would have done as joyfully well as we have this year without sacrificing something. Those who seek to save their life will lose it. And those who lose their life for my sake, says Jesus, for the sake of the gospel, will save it. It's how we live as Christians. It's the very principle of the cross. It's that Jesus goes to the cross and sacrifices his life and thereby grants resurrection and new life, not just to him, but to all the world. To all of us, all creation itself, the whole universe is renewed and given new life because of this principle. Those who seek to save their life will lose it. And those who lose their life for Jesus' sake will save it. What that means for us going forward out into the world is just like First English and just like my previous church and just like we did several months ago, going out into your everyday lives, you will have choices to make. You have the choice between trying to save your life and losing it. That's the choice you always face. On the one hand, you can do the prudent thing, the wise thing. The thing that our culture says is normal to do and try and save and store up for yourself. You could say to yourself, there's not enough money in the budget, there's not enough time, there's not enough energy, it can't be done, it's impossible, we just need to hunker down. We just need to try and save our lives. You could make that decision. But Jesus warns you there is no new life or resurrection down that path. The other way, the other choice you have going out into the world is a lot more risky. I'll grant you that. There is no automatic guarantee of success. After all, Jesus dies at the end of this Lenten journey, right? But the other alternative is you can go into the world and you can say, I'm not going to store up for myself, I will take a risk. You can go out into the world and you say, you know what, I think that criminal does deserve mercy. And you know what, I think that person who's asking for generosity actually should receive it. Even if I don't know what they'll do with it, I think they should receive it. You can go out into the world and say, you know what, I think that person who's asking for forgiveness should get it. You can go out into the world and say, you know what, that person who needs grace, even though they don't deserve it, perhaps they should receive it. Doing that, you will lose your life. It will require a sacrifice of some kind. Sacrifice of staying in a neighborhood you don't want to stay in, or the sacrifice of moving to a new worship space that might not be ready for it when we move there, or the sacrifice of just doing ministry in a different place. It will require a sacrifice. You will lose your life. But the thing we can trust is that because of Jesus, and all because of Jesus, those who lose their life for his sake, for the sake of the gospel, will save it. Amen.